Madam President, I rise today to emphasize the importance of this year's National Defense Authorization Act, both why it is important and what we must do and what we must accomplish this week while we're still here. Madam President, the primary obligation of Congress is to provide for the common defense. For the past 58 plus years, Congress has met this obligation primarily through passage of the NDAA. With this bipartisan legislation, we provide our armed forces the resources and authorities they need to defend our country. This bill keeps America on track by confronting the readiness crisis in our military branches. Madam President, I'm the first North Dakotan ever to serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I consider this a great honor. North Dakota is home to 2 Air Force bases, Minot, which is home to 2 of the 3 legs of the nuclear triad, the B-52 bomber and the Minuteman ICBM missiles, and 1 in Grand Forks, home to the RQ-4 Global Hawk mission, and effective in just a few days, on Friday, the 319th Reconnaissance Wing. We're also home to multiple Army and Air National Guard units and missions, ranging from construction and combat engineers to security forces, to ISR and launch and recovery Reaper operations. Our Army National Guard, in fact, has an air defense artillery regiment that regularly protects us right here in the capital region as part of Operation Noble Eagle. Madam President, our military community is a foundational element to our state as it is to many states. To us, the NDAA is not just arbitrary funding numbers for abstract aircraft and equipment. This legislation supports those in my state and across the country who defend our nation at home and around the world. We're honored by the outsized role that our patriots play in the defense of our nation and the cause of liberty. Our commitment to them and their families must be clear. When they are called into action, they will have every resource they need to carry out successful missions. Now, I want to address a fundamental aspect to this week's debate. Apparently, there are some in this body who would rather bypass budget negotiations and pass a continuing resolution. There are others who want to delay passage of this important priority until later in the year. Madam President, we cannot simply kick this can down the road. Passing a CR is handing our military community months of uncertainty and anxiety and could nullify much of the good work that we're doing here today and this week, such as improving the livelihood of our service members. And delaying passage to accommodate the political ambitions of a few of our Democratic colleagues is simply unacceptable and should be dismissed as quickly as it was suggested. Those who offer their lives in service to our country represent the best of what America has to offer. What they give us, we can never repay. But we can do our best to help as they serve and transition back to civilian life. For example, this NDAA seeks to improve the livelihood of our volunteer military force with benefits such as the largest pay increase in over a decade. It also provides military spouses looking for work or hoping to retain their job after being relocated personal assistance. We also include language that encourages the Air National Guard to provide tuition assistance. To keep us safe from foreign adversaries, this year's NDAA bolsters our nuclear triad with an enhanced commitment to modernization, a move that I firmly support. In fact, while recently visiting the Minot Air Force Base, I witnessed the reality the base's airmen face every day. Our brave men and women in uniform feel the weight of the world on their shoulders, yet they remain vigilant and alert, and most of the time quite cheerful, I might add. Madam President, deterrence works. It has always worked. Democrats and Republican administrations over the last several decades have supported it. Eliminating a leg of the deterrence does not eliminate the threat. The world does not become a safer place when we remove that which keeps us safe. If we defy history and the military community by unilaterally weakening our superior arsenal, as some in the House have proposed, we would be placing the fate of the world in the hands of our adversaries. Now, this is not to say the bill shouldn't be amended. In fact, I'd like to bring attention to a matter that's not currently included, but I believe should be. I submitted an amendment, along with the standalone bill, that honors the lost 74, the 74 Vietnam veterans who died in the sinking of the USS Frank E overseas in between combat missions. but whose names are not included on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. This year marks 50 years since they were killed off the coast of Vietnam while serving our nation. Congress passed this legislation last year in the House version of the NDAA, but it failed to be added in conference. This year I moved from the House to the Senate, and so did this bill. It has received overwhelming bipartisan support from my colleagues here and from constituents across the country. However, the bureaucrats in Washington remain firmly opposed. It is inexplicable to me that bureaucrats could determine that these sailors' ultimate sacrifice is unworthy of being memorialized simply because they were on the wrong side of an arbitrary line. Their disregard for these veterans has been a source of tremendous frustration to me throughout this process. I've had my own motives questioned. I've been told it would require too much work to change the memorial. I've even heard fears expressed of precedent being changed, as though finding more ways to honor the fallen and forgotten would somehow set a bad example for the future. Madam President, these excuses are insufficient. The lost 74 and the families they left behind deserve better than this, and I have no plans to quit this fight anytime soon for them. But this and other possible inclusions aside, this NDAA contains important national security efforts, including the establishment of the United States Space Force. The Senate Armed Services Committee came up with a bipartisan proposal that reduces redundancy in space programs, defines clear leadership on space at the upper echelons of our military, and guarantees dedicated service members to the space domain. I thank my colleagues for seeing the administration's vision and working in a bipartisan fashion to improve it. Madam President, I led two important amendments to the Space Force proposal that were adopted in the committee markup. The first requires the commander of the Space Force report directly to the Secretary of the Air Force after, of course, the first year after establishment. That is to say, a year after it's established, they would answer directly to the Secretary. The second holds that the commander of the Space Force become a permanent member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, also after the first year of establishment. Both were supported by the Department of Defense and should be maintained through the conference negotiations. The first provision, reporting directly to the Secretary, ensures that the Space Force commander has direct access to the top civilian leadership of the Air Force, just like the Navy Marine Corps model. The Commandant of the Marine Corps does not report to the Chief of Naval Operations. Neither should the Space Force commander be forced to report through the Air Force Chief of Staff. Reporting to the Secretary will give our Space Forces an equal voice in the Air Force's budget development process. We all know that real authority in the Pentagon is budget authority. And unless the Space Force has a true voice in the budget process, they will never be prioritized appropriately. When testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, Strategic Command Commander and Vice Chairman nominee, General Hyten, spoke to the challenges of the Air Force Chief of Staff making space a priority. And I quote, "We have to have somebody in the Pentagon that focuses their total attention on space all the time. I've known every Chief of Staff of the Air Force for the last 20 or 30 years, and they've all carried space effectively into the tank. They've all cared about space, but it is a secondary issue," unquote. Rather than automatically relegating space to a secondary issue, the Space Force commander should follow the Marine Corps model and report directly to the Secretary of the Air Force. In addition, the Space Force commander should be a statutory member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs, of course, are the primary military advisors to the President. The President makes strategic decisions on the composition and use of our national security resources based on the counsel received from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Without a separate, equal voice at the table, the Space Force commander will inevitably be marginalized from critical decision-making and resource allocation processes. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, reiterated this point when he said, quote, "The key is to have individuals that are singularly focused on space and make sure we incorporate that perspective, that very healthy perspective into the outcome, which is a joint force that can fight," unquote. Madam President, General Dunford is exactly right. The Space Force commander should have a seat on the Joint Chiefs and bring that singular focus of space to the table. Now, I understand the concerns surrounding these amendments, and I agree with my colleagues that we should minimize overhead and unneeded bureaucracy, which is why both of my amendments do not take effect for a year, and the language specifically bars any new staff or additional billets in the interim. Last week, the ranking member of the committee cited CBO estimates on the potential cost of these amendments. And I want to quote the same CBO report for some additional context and reference. The CBO report says, quote, "The estimates in this report are for illustrative policy options." Let me start over. Quote, "The estimates in this report are for illustrative policy options. They do not represent cost estimates for any particular piece of legislation," unquote. With that in mind, I would ask the Department of Defense to take these concerns seriously and use the 1 year to craft and present a plan to appropriately implement these two provisions. My colleagues' concerns are not unwarranted. However, it would be poor policy to hamstring the Space Force from the beginning rather than set it up for success. It's worth noting that the House NDAA establishes a Space Corps and takes two concrete steps directly in line with my amendments. The leader of the Space Corps would report directly to the Secretary of the Air Force and sits on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, without the 1 year delay that my amendment would require. The House, Senate, and Department of Defense are largely in line with these two provisions. The idea of the Space Force will become a reality with this year's NDAA. The establishment process will be incremental and requires oversight, but our first step must set the conditions to ensure its success. Madam President, the importance of this NDAA is clear. Passing it is vital to my state and to our nation. It supports our troops, bolsters our nuclear deterrence, and provides for the creation of a Space Force capable of defending the next domain of military conflict. For these and the dozens of other reasons, I urge my colleagues to support it and pass it quickly to demonstrate our commitment to our highest priority. And I yield the floor.